I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Sarah Smarsh, it is so good to see. It's been a minute. I think the last time I saw you in person, we were at one of those pre-pub lunches for Heartland, which
That's
was
right. Yes.
a really long time ago, but a National Book Award finalist, also a pick of what we then called the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers program. So you were in all stores and heaped up, and it was so good. It was so good to have that book out into the world. I felt like we really had something special when we were putting it out. And it took you 15 years to write Heartland, which we'll come back to. But the new book is a collection of essays called Bone of the Bone. And I didn't know this book was coming until someone sent me a bound manuscript. When did you decide to do an essay collection?
Well, first, hi, and also likewise, love to see your face. And it has been a minute. I'm a big fan of everything you do for the beautiful books we're trying to get out into the world. So the collection, I had started in earnest on another kind of long narrative book, which is right now it also in the works. But in the meantime, I just felt like current events and which, these are wild times for all of us to be alive in. But as someone who has been writing about socioeconomic class and also rural spaces for a couple decades at this point as a journalist, in more recent times as an author, I just thought, wow, I don't know if this is too audacious, but I'm going to ask my agent and editor what they think about maybe collecting some of the things that I've written, because I feel like in interviews I get asked to say this thing that I felt I answered a long time ago. And so why not just collect those all, bind them together and offer that up as a kind of statement, not just for like the today's news cycle, but for like the decade plus that those journalistic pieces comment on, which is, of course, of a piece with and leading into the moment we're living.
I want to go back to place for a second. You grew up in Kansas. You come from a long line of Kansans. And I'm going to ask you to describe Kansas as it is now and Kansas as it was when you were a kid, because it's a pretty special place.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I love this question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. So I was born in 1980, the literal dawn of the Reagan era. Also, the 1980s were, for me, on a fifth generation Kansas wheat farm. Very specifically, the farm crisis was a term in the news at that time, which was really just decades of policy that favored corporate ag coming to a head in the form of foreclosures among family farms like ours. We did make it through the 80s. I then had a Clinton administration adolescence, and in terms of like the landscape and policy, and it just generally felt like, specifically that rural space I was living in, small town businesses were going under, farms down the road were going under. And so it was a sense of sort of coming of age or growing up in a place that was by a lot of measures declining, even as the people there, were still fighters and full of spirit and love for their place and their traditions. But in a broader sense, zooming out from like economic and just kind of the stuff of getting by day-to-day life, I actually think, and this is one of the things that I love about my home, and I think this is a mark of places that are kind of unsexy and less glamorous, is that not a lot has changed. Now, if you look at political maps, there are different conversations we could have within that framework about ways in which certain demographics have shifted, and that has been discussed at length for sure. But the feel of the place, the look of the place, it's still like Prairie and the fields I used to work in. And there's a sense of having lived in New York and LA and Austin and lovely cosmopolitan places that I adore and miss greatly. Ultimately, this is home. It's always felt like home. And part of the charm is it abides. Kansas abides.
I love that description. You went back, though, after being in New York, right? You had been in New York for like 5 years, tenure track position at a university. You went back, your mom was not doing well, so you did go back in part for her, but also you went back in part for you, right?
Yeah, and actually the kind of the timeline of how that all shook out, and I do think it's all kind of a related and a domino effect. But I came back from New York prior to those various personal crises, in large part more out of a sense of professional calling. One, I was the beginning of my career as a journalist was like the moment that digital hit. And then it was like this freak out of like, how do we make money with journalism? And traditional business models were collapsing and imploding, and small and even mid-sized papers and outlets were folding. So it was like by 10 years after I graduated from journalism school in 2002. And I think that like by 10 years later, I was the only person I knew of in my graduating class who was still working as a reporter. So one was I knew that, the place I was from where, I had found myself in newsrooms as the only person with direct experience of a rural place or poverty or, various identity markers we might not always think of when we talk about diversity. But I was in some ways kind of even my, white self had brought some diversity of perspective and vantage to some of these newsrooms. And because of that dissonance with the backgrounds, largely class backgrounds of the folks I was surrounded by, I thought, it's really going to be on me to make sure that these blind spots about class and place are addressed. Well, then it came to me that the best way I could do that was by being on the ground in the place that I'm from. And to your point about I also went back for me, I'm really I love a good adventure. I love a good New York City sidewalk. But ultimately, I'm a country gal at heart and a homebody, and I just I love my home. It's not a very it's not how a lot of people understandably calculate their decisions because economic opportunity and other realities being what they are in our industrialized capitalist, uber capitalist society. But I did kind of just like leave some money on the table to be in a quieter place that felt good to my soul.
Part of writing about class too, and you mentioned this a couple of times in different pieces in Bone of the Bone, newsrooms are not usually populated by people like you because it's really expensive, right? Like the salaries are not great. You need to live in an expensive city, and it is very hard. And I've never worked in a newspaper, but part of what I'm concerned about as a consumer of news is that all of these tiny feeder papers, right? Like you used to be able to drive through any county in any place in America, and there would be like 2 or 3 newspapers, and some would be great and some would not be. And every year you saw Pulitzers going to big investigative pieces at tiny papers that you had never heard of. And that landscape has changed so dramatically. And it's deeply concerning. I think, a newspaper is part of its community, right? And it makes me sad and a little nervous. And yeah, not every paper is perfect, but you got to have a paper.
You got to have one. You got to have somebody at the county commission meeting, man.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the only way to genuinely follow the money. So, that sort of pinch point between 10 and let's call it 10 and 15, 2010 and 2015 is where it really starts to bottom out in ways that, the internet is good for a lot of things. It really, people are able to connect in ways that they weren't previously. I spend a lot of time managing my life, through apps and other assorted things. But the thing that I always come back to when I'm reading a piece by you, whether it's an essay or a book, is that you never lose sight of the community and that you move through these spaces. Like you grew up what most people would consider poor, and you guys always thought you were middle class because you didn't go hungry and you had a house.
Yep.
There's less of that perspective now. Mm-hmm. And can we just talk about your grounding and sort of how you approach telling a story? Because it really does seem to be people first with you.
Well, thank you for seeing that. It is it's not something I think about consciously, but as you speak it sounds right. And I know that that's what has guided not just some of my life decisions, which I was just expanding on, but also just the stuff of my work and the language even and who and what I hope to center in the writing, even when I'm using the first person. And it might seem like on the surface it's about me. That groundedness or sense of, we might say, fidelity to place or community. I don't know to what I can attribute that, but I can tell you that it tracks perfectly with the rural experience. In that, while we might think of it as a geographically remote and a spatially expansive place, and those things are right, the communities within that space, it's not unlike, in a sea of 10 million people, a good neighborhood, there's a tightness. You see the same dude at the bodega every day, and maybe you're even looking out for each other in some ways. It's so true when geographic isolation creates a distance from various resources or help in an emergency and so on, that you have no choice but to sense your vulnerability to and reliance upon, in some ways, the guy down the road when your tractor breaks down and it's snowing outside. So, I can hear some people saying, well, a lot of people that are from that place are now supporting political and cultural movements that are hyper individualistic and anti-community and unwelcoming, to say the least. And that's also true. But for me, what my upbringing imprinted on me was a sense of like, and by the way, community, of course, isn't just place, it's also the people. And you used that word yourself. If I'm being honest, I worked my ass off to get where I went, but I can't claim that as some sort of like triumph of self. Here's why. Public schools in Kansas were like friggin' awesome in the 1980s and 90s. I benefited from, there was a federal program that paid my application fees to graduate school. Miwa, I didn't even know what graduate school was when I was like a senior in college, like about to be a first generation college graduate. And so that I've always had this sense of like, okay, I'm going to work my ass off, but also only by the grace of society go I. And so I can't then just like amputate the place I'm from in that equation. That fabric, whether it's the hyper local or expand out to a broader community, or the ways in which all of these communities are connected, the people and the place who shaped me and who I still live among are foundational to my ability to speak, the cadence of my voice, what I know, who I am, the values I hold. And I got to be true to that rather than write about something or someone in the rearview mirror like it's someplace I got out of.
That social mobility is really important, though, and we're not doing a great job of it as a culture and a society and a country right now. But that kind of social mobility that you just described, like I got a great education, I was able to go do things, I was able to make choices as a result of opportunities that I wouldn't have otherwise had. I mean, part of the big beating heart of Heartland, right, is the fact that you're the first woman in many generations to have not had a teenage pregnancy. And
Correct.
Your mom, your mom was 17 when you were born. Your grandmother was around the same age when your mom was born. And to have that kind of runway, right? And I'm also thinking about, Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. It sits in a similar vein. Like, she was able to take the ACT. She was able to go to college. Her schooling had been a little informal until then. But when I hear stories like that, I'm like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to be about. You're supposed to be able to go out into the world and see what's there. And in your case, you sent yourself back to Kansas, but I think that's kind of great when you can go back. I mean, we saw it a little bit in Ohio. We've seen it in Kentucky. Like, there are places where people are just like, no, this is West Virginia, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's kind of exciting, I think.
I think it's thrilling. I think it's so exciting, and it makes my heart sing when I hear those stories about people. And it's the Odyssey. Prior to this sort of burgeoning movement that you're describing, we sort of had the go off for the elixir as the hero of your journey, but never go back. But the story, the circular, the Joseph Campbell story. We could critique that model or that idea or that conceit in a story, but if that's a thing and that's an archetype, it's the full circle coming back that we've just sort of been leaving hanging as the contemporary United States of America, or I'd say post-industrial. So I think this is like maybe finally a little bit of a course correction from the capitalist and industrial forces that forced people out of places that they otherwise might not have wanted to leave, frankly.
I mean, I worry about people in communities where they don't have a hospital. That seems ill-considered. And I realize there are financial decisions that go into that, but I don't think people should have to go without schools or hospitals, but maybe that's just me. I do want to talk a little bit more about class for a second. You worked on Heartland for 15 years. These essays run sort of concurrently with sort of Heartland coming out into the world in 2015 and up until 2022 or 23.
Well, there's a new essay that I just finished this year, but yeah, most of the pieces from periodicals were like 2013 to 23. Yeah.
So you're writing about class, and you've got people at home who are kind of like, could you please not tell these stories? We don't really want these out in the public. There's a certain amount of pride that goes with that, right? Like, we've been invisible. We're feeling a little shame. Why are you telling our secrets? And then you've got the other side of the equation, which is people sort of, well, stereotyping you, right? For lack of whatever. I mean, people aren't always kind, right? So you're standing in this sort of liminal space saying, hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. I have a story to tell. How are you navigating living in essentially liminal space?
It is liminal. It's wild. Even as I feel grounded in the ways I described, it's also always a kind of simultaneous sense of, if I'm being totally honest, never completely belonging in one place. You know, among my family and community, I'm different for where I've been and what I've done, and my, most crucially, my formal education. And then, you know, when I'm hanging out with my peers within my industry in some city, I'm different for where I come from, and maybe for my accent after I've had a few drinks or something. But while that came with some consternation and some pain when I was very young, I now see it as, you know, what a blessing to get to kind of in some ways live two lives and walk in two spaces and endeavor to, through my work, as you said, wave a flag and say, I have a story, particularly in the more powerful of those spaces, that might help me share it to alleviate some of the negative and corrosive ideas about a place I know firsthand that hasn't always been represented fairly.
Yeah, most outsiders do end up being writers, right? Like, what else were you going to do?
You know,
there was nothing else you were going to do.
It's nothing original that I'm doing here in the end. I'm just being a weirdo that had been like, was sitting on the swing set watching everybody else, and all that watching and observing formed a writer. And because of who I am and where I come from, this is what the moment asks for me to write.
Well, I think it's also important for us, and I'm going to steal a phrase from you. You describe it as the chaos of poverty, right? It's really expensive to be poor. This is something that Matthew Desmond has covered, certainly in Evicted and Poverty by America. And if you haven't read either of those, I'm going to say, hey, please go read them. But it's really expensive to be poor, and it's really chaotic between the moving and the you're not quite sure what's going on with school or all of these things. And to be able to take that experience and turn it sort of on its ear, right? Like, not everyone gets the opportunity to do that. And you see it, right? Like, you even talk about a piece that you wrote when you were a senior in college. The Associated Press picks it up, puts it out over the wire. Suddenly, you're in newspapers that you would not have previously been in. And essentially, it jumpstarts your career. And that's what, 2000? 2000, early 2000? 2001. Okay.
2001, yeah.
And that doesn't quite happen anymore. I mean, The Wire doesn't really work the way it used to. And all props to the Associated Press. But the media business, again, this landscape has changed, and your career has sort of had to evolve with it. And when I see the outlets that you've run pieces in, I'm also guessing some of them paid you $50 if you were lucky, right?
Oh, hell yeah, if I was lucky. I mean, I'm sure there's a couple, you know, earlier, well, shoot, I was in my early 30s by the time I wrote the earliest of these pieces. So it wasn't like I was like a freshly minted J school grad, but in like fighting to get a sort of like voice on with a national platform, and somebody who had been doing local reporting in earnest, which I'm so grateful for. your payment is exposure. That was true for that HuffPo piece that starts out the collection. But even now, as you were noting earlier in our conversation, it's not a business that people go into to get rich. And for that reason, it isn't some like particular insult to me that my work and time is being underpaid. It's that just about everybody's is underpaid. But if you have a cushion or a rich husband or a trust fund or a wealth background, don't matter much. To me, it's literally my livelihood. And so I've had to be scrappy and, I had spent some time in academia, as you noted, did some grant writing for nonprofits. I've found ways to pay the bills as a writer. And I've always, meanwhile, been doing my work as a journalist or, working on a memoir for a million years when I had time. Also, poured some whiskey at a biker bar along the way. So like, yes, the moment I graduated into was particularly painful for the industry. And that meant a double whammy with what already was true, as you noted, about the unpaid internship or the crap pay story for even like a legacy journalism outlet in spaces where it's like, I've learned it's uncouth to talk about money. And it's like, well, I have no choice but to talk about money. So I've drawn some hard lines now, but early in a career didn't have that luxury or privilege.
It's interesting watching the arc of your career actually in Bone of the Bone. You can tell as you get more comfortable, not just in your point of view, just stylistically, there's a very clear Sarah Smarsh voice. And I want to talk about literary influences for a second, because clearly you are a very observant human being and have been since you were tiny, because there are details and cultural moments where I'm like, oh yeah, okay. But you did go to J school. So I think you're pulling both from this sort of literary tradition, but also some of the great newspaper writers. And can we talk about those people for a second?
I would love it. Yeah. I just consumed books avidly, of course, as any would-be writer would as a child, and anything I could get my hands on across genres. Love the fiction, love the poetry, but what I'm about to tell you about is some white men who wrote nonfiction, because that's who young Sarah came across when she was trying to figure out this thing about a form of writing that's at once fact-based, factual, and deeply felt. And so I was a big admirer when I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do as a journalist of Studs Terkel. His book Working was like, to me, okay, now it's not a narrative, and it's really just almost a question and answer format, but he's really sort of bypassing himself, not just by leaving out the first person, but by not even touching a story to shape it and giving these long passages of dialogue. You could argue that it almost approaches oral history to his subjects or these folks he's having conversations with about their work and their jobs while they're on the job talking about labor. So it was important to me he'd been doing that for decades by the time I came across his work as a young writer. But it felt for me revelatory because as a young person, I was living and working in a time when no one was talking about class. So I admired journalists who I was never a big fan of the gonzo. I wasn't into like that sort of blurring the edge of, I'm going to take some liberties with the details and create this pretty much true, but a little bit fanciful Truman Capote kind of thing. With all due respect to the important role that type of work has played within the genre, it wasn't really my thing. I wanted to find a way as someone who intended to be a reporter, and that's how I had started at newspapers when we were still kind of at the tail end of that era. I wanted to find a way to be at once exquisitely accurate. Memory, by the way, when we get into memoir, is of course fallible and imperfect. But what I always argue is, if you're being true to your memory, if you're not, I will never intentionally fabricate anything or give a detail that is not as I literally saw it or literally remember it. So there's a sense of responsibility to the objective, even as much of what I'm writing, the real part of the matter is in the subjective experience. And there I would bring in, probably a pretty close contemporary to Studs Terkel, but a totally different type of writer in life. Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, of course, the seminal Pulitzer Prize winner from the 90s, was very important to me for showing me. And by the way, by the time I came across that book in college, I had certainly read beautiful, important masterpieces where dialect leads and marginalized people are centered in the memoir form. They were just about always coming from marginalized racial identities. And so while they were no less instructive to me as a writer, and I admired them in myriad ways, Frank McCourt was talking specifically about being a poor white kid in Limerick, Ireland, and there too is a dialect. So it was sort of it made me realize the poetry and the language of the place that I come from. That itself is, I guess, what I'm getting at is in cultural terms, I had only previously had a sense of my use of language and the way that that informed my expression in this sort of compartmentalized way where there's my fancy English, which is what I learned in school, and then my country, my native tongue country. Frank McCourt wasn't from a rural place, but his sort of just embracing and exalting what he obviously admired as the natural rhythm of his, of course, Ireland, they're, you would say, lousy with poetry, but that was true of my people and place too. I tell people often I have 3 different degrees in writing, and absolutely the most important thing to my syntax and cadence and ability to express myself is just the people I was surrounded by who never finished high school. And so I'd throw out those 2 moments encountering a book as a young person where it was like, this is a thing you can do.
All right. So the people around you are one of your degrees in writing. What are the other 2? I mean, J School has to be one of them, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what's the third?
Well, when I was an undergrad, and this is at the University of Kansas, I double majored in. I also got an English degree in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, which with an emphasis in creative writing. There too, had this sort of weird duality going on where when I was in the J School, I was like the artsy weirdo that they would want to send for like the human interest stories or like to write about subcultures or cover the arts or whatever. And then when I was in the halls of the English department, or particularly among the creative writing majors, I was like the weirdo that wanted to write about the things that happened here in the objective world. And then I went on to Columbia and got a Master's of Fine Arts in nonfiction. So again, that sort of tension between the fact and the art.
But can't we have both?
Can't we have both, Miwa?
I would like both, please. I mean, I think of someone like, Patrick Radden Keefe, right? Like that, Beth Macy, right? We get the facts, like they chase the money, they chase the truth. And then we get beautiful sentences too.
Beautiful.
And, you just kind of sit there quietly going, I cannot believe, and yet, right? Like they are just, they are 2 of my favorites working now. And I'm sort of desperately waiting for Keefe's next book, which is apparently about the Russian oligarchy living in London. And I'm like, yes, please, may I read this now?
Yes.
I have a feeling it's going to take a minute. But one of the things I do love about Heartland, too, is the response that you've had from readers around the country who are kind of like you, kind of not like you. See, this to me, I love this when a book has legs like this, right? You toured for like 3 years after this book came out. You were like living out of this much I remember. You were living out of a suitcase, essentially talking to anyone and everyone, anywhere. And you would have people who some grew up not dissimilar to you, and others would come up to you and just be like, no, you told my story. And you're like, okay, hi. Can we talk about some of those responses, and can we just bring all of those readers into this conversation? Because I think that's kind of cool.
Yes. And I love the opportunity to speak to that because I think really at a thematic level, the most important thing that I offer or try to offer is a complicating of the assumptions that we make about others. And class is one of those arenas where we can make a lot of assumptions just by sizing somebody up visually. Sometimes class leaves a physical marker, and sometimes physicality predicts accurately some class experiences, but not always. What I loved about being on the road with Heartland was not only did I hear from people who are like, I'm broke right now and I got a hold of this in the library, and thank you for helping me feel seen. Gosh, does that make a writer's heart sing and feel like this is why I do the work? But also, I would say the most powerful messages that I received were from people who were kind of more like me, that feel like they're sort of a bridge person. Maybe the details don't track. Maybe they're an immigrant. And so now there's this sort of like two-ness about their experience that has to do with class, but also ethnicity and race in ways that I can't relate to. But it felt like it became in some ways less a story just about, white rural America or, class with a capital C, than it was a story about like people who are like, the way that we talk about our culture and politics and groups is too simplistic. And there's W.B. Du Bois would have called a dual consciousness that so many of us experience in different ways. It might have nothing to do with class. It might have to do with race, gender, religion, myriad other things. And there's something about getting into that space with people that's so vulnerable and so beautiful and so true and complicated and complex and nuanced. And just those conversations were like a balm or a salve against the backdrop of just these really silly ways that we talk about ourselves and our country.
You also almost ran for the Senate in Kansas. We have to talk about this for a second. The pieces are great. You had access to some very good advice from very well-known people. But running for office isn't necessarily what I saw on your trajectory, and I'm not sure it's what you saw in yours either. But I do want to bring that into the conversation because, it could have been really interesting.
Would have been interesting. That was one of those Robert Frost poem, two paths diverge kind of situations for sure. And I still think about how different life might have been had I made the other decision. But yeah, I didn't see it coming on my trajectory either. That was really a summons from without, not within. A lot of people were encouraging me to run. At the moment, we had an open seat in Kansas. The longtime, decades-long Senator Pat Roberts, right-wing conservative, was vacating his seat, and political, conventional wisdom is that an open seat is a lot more prime for the taking than challenging an incumbent, unless they're deeply unpopular. But Republican incumbent senators in Kansas tend to do okay defending their seats, like for the last 90 years. And so you had the open seat. Also, that was like, we were still kind of in the Bernie moment, the like in Kansas, by the way, more people caucused for Bernie Sanders in the primaries than for Donald Trump. So there was like this populism that was brewing that, ultimately and unfortunately was only leveraged successfully by one party for nefarious reasons. But there was nonetheless at that moment a sense that like someone like me, who I come from where I do and I hold progressive ideas and values, might actually have a shot at disrupting this like almost century long run of Republican Senate representation here. So I was encouraged by, reader. I'd be in an event and it would be like a shout, run, Sarah, run. And I felt like, what an honor for someone to give me that vote of confidence, have that aspiration for me, even if it hadn't been my own directly. And so I looked into it, talked to, as you say, some powerful people, went to Washington, met with Chuck Schumer, had a phone call with Elizabeth Warren, talked to people at Emily's List and other factions of that whole sort of machine and enterprise that is politics. And I came really, really, really close, Miwa, to running. And then ultimately, like as much as my mind could come up with a million reasons why it made sense and it could be great, and in a sense of responsibility to place too, if there was a chance that with a lot of people's help that we could shift the political tide here, like who cares what you were planning on doing next year? Like, do that. But ultimately, in the end, I think it's the writer in me. I think it's the weirdo writer in me. I just was like, I was born and bred and made to write about that space, maybe to observe that space, but to be in it, that's a different kind of cat. And God bless him. But it didn't seem like how I could be of right service with what I've got to offer. And I will say, and like I mentioned that I had the great fortune of speaking with Elizabeth Warren, who's one of my heroes, speaking of, folks who deign to talk about class and wealth inequality. And I sent her a thank you note and said I wasn't going to run. And she wrote back very kindly and said there are many ways to serve. And it gives me chills right now remembering that, because ain't it the truth?
Totally. So now that these essays, all of these pieces were sort of written in the moment in response. That's what an essay is, right? You're writing in response to a moment that is happening or has happened or somehow connects with a larger point that you're trying to make. But now they're collected in a single volume. And I'm wondering if anything surprised you once you sort of put them together into one space and said, okay, this is something I hadn't noticed before.
Yes. And I'm well suited to answer that question right now, because just last week I read the audiobook. And so that was like an experience of front to back, taking these words through my own vocal cords and seeing if they still feel right. And I'd say what surprised me was because I guess I sort of still kind of situate myself within a journalistic vein, even though I write in more expansive ways. I do always think of myself as kind of, as you say, in response to a moment. And I'm not usually like stepping back and having some, long view to the past or the future. And I thought, well, gosh, I have been consistent in saying largely the same thing for a long time. And that made me feel good about it. It said to me that as someone who prizes authenticity and truth above all else, that whether it was fashionable or not to be giving a certain message, it's what I was giving if I found it to be true. And so I guess that wasn't necessarily a surprise, but just more like a pleasant validation, I thought. What has changed is that I felt like in some of the earlier essays, there's a little bit more of an edge, or a little grumpier. I was quite a bit grumpier, Miwa. I was really quite pissed off, actually, around like 2016, as were many of us. But what I was pissed off about specifically, a sense of outrage about or misrepresentation in the mainstream media's portrayal of rural America or white working class people. While I stand by everything I said, and I don't believe you'll find a statistic or a point in the book you could patly pronounce as incorrect, even if you disagree with my perspective. Even as I stand by it all, I've that sort of edge of rage you can't really like hold for a lifetime.
Right.
At some point, you have to just sort of get a little softer and a little more gentle. And I'm glad that righteous fire was documented, and now it lives in bone of the bone forever, I hope. But I myself, like, I think, and this would be true probably of anyone looking back on yourself of 10 or 15 years ago. If you're doing it right, you probably chilled out a little bit.
And speaking of chilling out, I do want to bring up your Dolly Parton book. And we're also going to talk about what you're working on too, because I think that's pretty cool. But She Come By It Natural. And it's not just Dolly, but I'm going to grab a copy for a second because this package is really good. It's so good. How did the Dolly Parton book come about?
So I signed up with the good people at Scribner for Heartland in 2015. And for some reason, thought this would be a perfect time to also apply for this writing fellowship through a magazine I love called No Depression, which kind of covers like the roots in Americana music scene. And they had this fellowship that was like, send us your idea. And they were going to pick one writer to write quarterly. I believe they still have a print magazine, and write 10,000 words a hit. So it was like an opportunity to write 40,000 words in magazine form about specifically some aspect of Americana or roots music that speaks to cultural considerations of our time. And I was like, boy, do I have a pitch for you about Dolly Parton is low key the greatest feminist who ever lived. And then I, very fortunately was selected, but then unfortunately had to write that concurrent with delivering on my manuscript deadline for Scribner with Heartland. But so that started as a 4-part series written over the course of about a year for these quarterly installments of the fine magazine No Depression. And then a few years after it came out, I can't remember. I think it was my lovely editor, Kathy Belden's idea was like, what if we put that in book form?
Yeah.
And it was kind of largely already there. I had to sort of, massage the contents to find this new form together as a book. Similar challenges presented in Bone of the Bone, where readers might find that, and I actually kind of apologize for this in the introduction, because I've been writing on the same themes for so long, and because my background and identity is part and parcel to my weighing in on them, you'll hear me repeat across the course of the book, if you read front to back, I grew up on a farm, I'm from rural Kansas, things that if it were constructed as a through narrative, you would handle more gracefully. I had to do this similar sort of work with the Dolly book. But anyway, that's how She Come By It Natural materialized.
And your new book, which is still in progress, but I'm very excited to read, is about the Kansas Prairie. It's a much larger scale. And I have to say, when I first heard about it, I was like, okay, if anyone can do it, it's Sarah. But at the same time, it is a little different in some ways. Not entirely. It's not like suddenly you decided to write a cookbook, but I want to talk about where this project is right now and sort of how it got kicked off, because it's a lot. It's very cool, but it's a lot.
It is a lot. Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for your enthusiasm. I do think that the topic of, so the tallgrass prairie specifically, it's the most endangered ecosystem in North America, and also probably one of the most little known and little championed. I don't think it's a coincidence that it's located in a place that some folks call flyover country. It's located in a region that has largely been ravaged for industrial agriculture. It's the stuff of flatlands, grasslands are, it's a particular taste. We are a culture following largely from European colonizers that reveres mountains and forests. And I come from a place that has neither. Generally speaking, there are nooks and crannies of the Great Plains in the Midwest, of course, riparian regions of gorgeous native oak hickory stands. And it is one of the world's great grasslands. And there's only about 4% of it actually intact. That's because of forces of both agriculture and now what is called woody encroachment, which is basically like trees moving in, because the indigenous peoples who were murdered or driven off of this land were no longer present to conduct the controlled burns that used to fight back those trees to maintain this sort of grassland, bison reliant culture and healing landscape that they used for nutrition and survival. So the tallgrass prairie is threatened. It's something that I care about firsthand because it is the native ecosystem of my place. And I think that it's actually of a piece with my other work. While it's not about the political or the sociological, the prairie and the people I write about have quite a bit in common in that they've been overlooked and maybe even devalued. So it's sort of classic to say, oh, I had to drive from St. Louis to Denver, and that's the most boring drive I've ever been on in my life. Well, true from Interstate 70. But the thing about a prairie is you have to get out of your car and walk out into it and look, and then you see and you smell and you're struck by the vastness of the sky and the foreverness of the horizon. And to me, it's heaven. Mountains, cool. Forests, lovely. But a prairie, now that is heaven on earth. And so my book hopefully will both reveal that to people and celebrate it, but also describe the truly critical moment we're at in terms of saving and preserving that ecosystem by way of policy and staving off the destructive forces that are destroying it.
Yeah, that seems like the perfect place to end this conversation, Sarah. I love the way you described the Prairie, and I cannot wait to read that book, and I will sit here quietly while you finish it. But it's really good to see you. Bone of the Bone is out now. If you haven't read Heartland or the Dolly Parton book, please go pick those up.
Thank you, Miwa. Thanks so much.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Bone of the Bone. I'm Marc at my store in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Mary down in Texas.
Hi, Marc.
I am going to go ahead and kick things off. I was thinking about Bone of the Bone. I was thinking about the way that Sarah Smarsh is just so magnificent at spotlighting people and places that may get overlooked, especially in America. Just the way that she is not afraid to really sink into some dark territory while never feeling like she is being exploitative. She hits the balance so well. I love the way that she writes. But as I was thinking about her writing and what she does for our country, it made me think of this short story collection that came out a while back called American Salvage by Bonnie Jo Campbell. Ooh, this book. This is a short story collection that is gritty and grounded, and each story builds this tapestry and full view of rural working class life. So all of the stories are set in the eroding Rust Belt of America. And while the stories are haunting and sometimes incredibly brutal, they also have this almost writing adjacency to somebody like a Flannery O'Connor, in that Campbell's ability to see and show and tell in very brilliant ways a look at a life, not necessarily just an individual's life, but as a culture, as a subset, as a piece of Americana. You have a story where a young woman is facing a very brutal and horrific trauma while dressing a deer. You have a man who is going to any lengths possible to get a fix. Man, that story really just got under my skin. And you get all of these people who are very close to home for a lot of readers, very far removed for a lot of readers, but all very, very honest and very genuine feeling. I think that these people will haunt readers in a way that I feel like is important, and they will also teach you. And I think by reading their stories, I think the reader has an opportunity to bring these characters some version of solace that they really need and deserve. It feels like a relationship, like you are giving these characters something that they really need, even though they'll never really see it, and they're giving something to you. It's a reciprocity that I don't see that often when reading pieces about marginalized subsects and culture. So the way that it's done is just, it's tough, but it is work that is worth it, if that makes sense. So please check out American Salvage by Bonnie Jo Campbell. It's beautiful. Mary, what do you have for us?
So my introduction to Sarah was She Come By It Natural by about Dolly Parton and women who live their songs. And anything Dolly adjacent, I'll pick up. So my pick for TBR Top Off is called The Forgotten Girls and Memoir of Friendship and Lost Promise in Rural America by Monica Potts. Now, Monica is a journalist who retraces her steps growing up in rural Arkansas. She digs like an archaeologist, where the split happened between her and her best friend, Darcy. Both girls grew up in similar working class backgrounds in rural Arkansas. Both were very smart, both at school. Monica is the one who became the journalist, who went to one of the Seven Sisters colleges of Bryn Mawr, and Darcy became a rural poverty statistic. And Monica flinching with the raw detail. She's honest. We're for the events where the split happened, but the circumstances were where she excelled and she got out of poverty, out of the working class area, and Darcy Dade. She mixes personal story and statistics, all moving the narrative from, when they were very small to the present. She keeps coming back to when you have the burden of poverty, it's mostly placed on women. And when I was reading this, I kept thinking about Greta Gerwig's Barbie and Amara Ferrer's speech that she gives, that it's always, always the woman's fault. It doesn't matter how hard we try, but it's always our fault. She kind of delves into the statistics. It moves very quickly. You don't think you're reading something about statistical analysis about poverty. You were reading, honestly, a thriller. It sometimes feels like are these girls going to get out? So my pick for TBR Top Off is The Forgotten Girls, a memoir of friendship and lost promise in rural America by Monica Potts.
Oh, such a good book. That's a tough one to read, and it's infuriating, but it's so important. So
yes.
Yeah, love it. Great pick, as always. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. And where can we find you, Mary?
You can follow me at my home store at BN Beaumont TX.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.